In this video, I'm going to show you how I painted Superman's portrait. This is ground affected. My name is Brent and welcome to sticking your fingers together with super glue. And yes, this will be an update to a previous video in which I had painted Peter Parker's portrait. Again, this one was sculpted by B3 Berserk 3D, whereas the Peter Parker that I did was sculpted by their sister company 3D Wicked. And this is a long video because I'm gonna go over a whole load of techniques and a load of stuff just in order to explain how I painted the portrait for this particular sculpt. And of course, before we carry on, if you would like to click the like button and perhaps consider subscribing so that you don't miss out on future videos, then I would appreciate that. And if you feel like by the end of the video I haven't lived up to your standards, it's as easy as taking that away again and clicking the dislike button and following the instructions that I give in the last few seconds. And of course, if you feel like you want to support the channel any further, then make sure to watch the next video that's suggested at the end of this one. And without too much waffle at the beginning of a video, let's get straight into painting. What's your name again? Good old Clark, that's it. Let's just get straight into painting Clark Kent as a Superman. Not too much has changed since the last time that I painted a portrait and explained how I did that. The only thing that's changed this time, perhaps from the last time, is that I didn't use a zenithal highlight. But as per usual, I start out with reddish flesh as my base coat for this specific portrait. And I do this for a very specific reason. The reason that I'm using this color is because this is the shadows of the entire portrait. Technically, I'm gonna make those shadows a little bit purpler, maybe a little bit redder, but this is the baseline for the shadows on the portrait. I'm gonna start out by layering super thin layers. I'm gonna thin the paint down with just plain water through my airbrush, and I'm gonna layer it 2 to 3 times to make sure that I get a solid base coat. I'm then gonna use base flesh, and I'm gonna spray that from the top down angle. This is because the light source that I've chosen is coming from directly front on and slightly above the figure. I'm now going to start working my way up, and I'm going to use natural flesh as the next tone. I'm not going to wash out my airbrush between each one because this is going to help bring these tones together. By not washing it out, I'm mixing the colors and essentially creating a color in between. One thing that I can definitely say when adding these layers is not to use a super saturated version of the paint. By that, what I mean is thin the paint down quite a lot, because the thinner it is, the more it's going to blend with the next layer that's underneath it. Now I'm going to thin down medium flesh quite thin, and I'm going to use that to spray the next layers of highlights onto the skin. This medium flesh has a slightly orange tone to it, a little bit of pink in it as well, so it's something that's going to bring out a little bit more life in the tones. I'm then going to continue building up the highlights, this time using fairy flesh, and I'm going to focus that on mainly the areas where the light's going to hit. I'm also going to mix a little bit of highlight skin into that, and I'm going to, again, using a super thin layer of this stuff, I'm going to build it up slowly but surely. By mixing the two, what I'm doing is not going too high with the highlight. That way I can come back if I really needed to and use that highlight again in future. Now that I've got the base tones down for the skin and we have some value and it's looking good, we're going to start to add a little bit more life into that skin. I'm going to thin down Grimoire Purple. Grimoire Purple is something that I've always said I use to create a little bit more saturation in my skin tones. This also helps create the depth as well. If you notice, I use a super thin glaze version of this paint, and to make that is super easy. All you've got to do is mix much more water than you have paint, and that way you will create something that is able to be built up upon, but also it will be able to be seen through, and this is something that you can use to your advantage to help create glazes on the model. As you can see, I've focused the shadows to the sides of his heads, around the temple, underneath his cheekbones, and I kept the light specifically down the center of his face. Now for something that is new that I'm going to introduce, which I haven't previously used before, but it has been seen in previous videos, and I'm going to use a glaze of yellow. In my case, I feel like I made this glaze just a little bit too strong, and I would 100% suggest making it a little bit more watery than this. The only reason I use this is to bring a little bit of that yellowy tone that you see in a skin tone, especially in comics and things like that. One thing to note about my specific painting style is that I don't paint hyper realistic. Yes, I could learn to paint like that, and sure, it looks great, but it's not my preferred style of painting because I prefer a comic book look to my characters. Once I've got that glaze down, I need to come back in and layer colors again. This is going to be layering the highlights all over again. And yes, we're going back over a lot of that work, but the whole trick to having a good looking skin tone is to layer the living daylights out of those colors. Once I've got a good base for what I'm happy with for the skin tones, I'm going to paint a satin varnish over the top. This could be matte or it could be satin. In my case, the satin was closer than the matte, and so I took the satin. Now for the hair. Yes, Superman has black hair in the comics, but I don't want to go super dark black because it will be too stark and the contrast will be too high. And of course, the easiest way for me to do this is to paint it at first brown. This is going to be the undercoat for the hair. Later on, I'll come back and glaze over that with black because this will give me more control over where I want lights, highlights, low lights, and all the rest of the things. Carefully around the edges, I'm going to make sure that I get all the raised parts of hair so it doesn't look awkward. And in case you can't find Mecha varnish, you can also use high coat or any matte clear lacquer, and you can spray this through a spray can as well. Make sure to seal each layer as you're happy with them. If you're happy with the layer, seal it in because this will help you be able to clean off if you need to, or even to go back a little bit in your steps. For the eyebrows, I mixed that Sidewall brown that I used for the hair and a little bit of black, and a super tiny paintbrush. I painted lots of little hairs across his eyebrow. These don't have to be super perfect. If it was a comic book, there would be a solid line on the bottom and a solid line on the top, and it would be colored solid all the way through with a little highlight to the middle of the brow. But it's not a comic book, it's kind of somewhere half between, so I give it a little bit of hair. It kind of looks like hairs, but at the end of the day, as one piece, it brings it all together very nicely. This is where I glazed the black. I just used a plain black from Vallejo model paints, and I just glazed that over areas that I wanted darker than the other areas. Again, I'm going to lay another matte lacquer clear coat over the top of that to seal everything in and protect it for the next layers. Going on to his eyes, at first I'm going to mix the brown and the black again, a very similar color to what I had painted his eyebrows in, and I'm going to paint the entire shape of his eye. This is what's going to frame the eye and make it easier for you to make the shapes of the eye look nice and pleasing to your own eye. Whilst that is drying, I'm going to come back and I'm going to use Fairy Flesh to just paint across the bottom lids of the eye. This is just going to help to create a little bit more depth, and if you look carefully, those parts of your eye are a little bit lighter. There is bags just underneath it, but we will deal with that later. For the lips, I just mixed a tiny little bit of red with the base color of reddish flesh, and I painted that directly on. I'm then going to use ROXY Flesh Shade as a shade, which is technically a wash. Whatever you want to call it, it is one of those things, and I'm going to use that in the creases and crevasses of his eyes, nose, around the mouth, the corners of his mouth, inside of his nostrils, around his ears and things like that. This is going to help create a little bit more depth. Be careful not to allow this to pull up, because if it pulls, it's going to look like poo-poo. Whilst that's all drying, I'm going to come back into the eyelids again, mixing a tiny bit of red back into that Fairy Flesh to create a slight pinkish tone. I'm going to use that across the bottom of the eyelid, which I had already lightened up by using the Fairy Flesh at first. I also came back and I needed to darken certain areas with the ROXY Flesh Shade. Also, while I was there, I realized I wanted to add a little bit more shadows to the things like the furrow in his brow and the little wrinkles on his forehead. I also take the liberty to water that down and go around the outside edge of his hairline. Then using Highlight Skin, I'm going to paint now the shape of his eyes. This is the shape of his eyeballs essentially. I mix a little bit of blue and a little bit of black, and I mix that into that highlight skin, and I paint that into the corners of the eye, both the outside and the inside corner. I then come back with that highlight skin and I paint over the center of the eye. This helps create a little bit of depth. If I was going for realism, I would use something like pink or reddish pink to paint those corners, but because I'm going for a comic book look, I use a bluish gray. For the irises, I started out with just plain blue from Vallejo. I mixed a little bit of black so that it was dark and desaturated, and I painted the main shape of the iris. This is the overall shape. Whenever you paint an iris, try to paint it a little bit bigger than what you think it would be. This is because if you've painted it big enough, the chances are you've probably painted it just a little bit too small. I then took crystal blue and I slowly worked my way up using 2 to 3, maybe even 4 layers on that iris, and I worked up to the crystal blue. While that was drying, I dry brushed a base layer of the blue from Vallejo that I used originally across his hair. And I came back with the black after that, and I painted the pupils of his eyes. I added a little white spot in the top right corner just to create a highlight. Once that had all dried, I threw a little bit of Resin flesh shade into my airbrush, and I went back in to airbrush some of the shadows on his face. This specifically targeted around the temples of his face, also around the brow line and around his cheeks and underneath of his chin. Be careful not to overuse this because you can make him look like he's been on a Spanish holiday very quickly. Add a gloss into the eyes and onto the lips. You don't have to add it onto the lips, but it's a good idea to add it to the eyes. It creates a little bit more life when you're looking at the piece. Hopefully you managed to pick up some tips and tricks within this video that will help you making your entire hobby a lot easier. And of course, if you did, the best thing you can do is share it with your gran. And once you've done that, you might as well join her in the description and click onto the Patreon link where you can support the channel even further. Make sure to click the like button, or as they say in the land of YouTube, smash the like button, click subscribe, ring the little notification bell, and if you don't like anything you saw, just click dislike button